So today I'm going to present some joint work with Thomas Leopold at the University of Cologne and on the cost of widowhood, a matching study of process and event. And this talk comes at a pretty good time for us. So we're in the middle of deeply revising as a decision letter said, the manuscript, and so can really use any input you might have. So in this study, we seek to address kind of two overarching questions. The main one really being, what are the consequences of widowhood on mental health and economic well-being? And here, not just during widowhood, so just not at the time period of the event, but also the time following the event of spousal death. But we're also going to look at how those consequences differ relative to meaningful comparison groups. And so here, as hopefully at some point you'll agree with me, those meaningful comparison groups are going to be those who expected the event of widowhood and those who didn't expect the event of widowhood, compared to continuously married individuals who did not experience what we're going to call the process that leads to the event of widowhood. Now, there are quite a few ways how we could motivate looking at the consequences of widowhood. I mean, on the one hand, many European or many societies are experiencing population aging, so at least the frequency of widowhood events will increase in coming years. But also, at least in sociology, compared to other critical life transitions, widowhood is relatively understudied. So at some point I looked at this, and there are about 5 to 6 publications, peer-reviewed publications on divorce for every publication on widowhood. So, but I kind of want to take a little step back and talk a bit more broadly about life transitions first. Also, to kind of motivate this in a much more general setup. So, in sociology and in the social sciences more broadly, there's really been a lot of research on how life courses and to what extent life course transitions impact individual well-being, both positively and negatively. The most common transitions that are studied are probably unemployment, marriage, parenthood, divorce, retirement, widowhood, children leaving the parental home, but there are certainly many more. Now, very broadly speaking, these transitions are considered to be something like stressors that have an immediate impact on individual well-being, and then that require some adjustment to where individuals return at least close to pre-event baseline levels. So if we want to kind of visualize this in terms of a picture, then here we, some outcome, time before the event, and then time after the event. And we basically see here a decrease in the outcome. So let's just say decrease in well-being, followed by an increase here. So a recuperation to a certain extent. Now, we know from decades of research that there's considerable variation in the impact of life transitions. So on the one hand, there's considerable variation across events. So events vary, for example, in how stressful they are. With widowhood, for example, in terms of its predictability or unpredictability, but also across events in terms of desirability or undesirability. So we'll hope for widowhood, at least, that this tends to be an undesirable life transition. But there are also differences between individuals in the impact of life transitions. So one common argument here is differential vulnerability. So the idea that individuals are equipped with different resources and strategies to be able to deal with the stressors or with the stress involved with transitions. Now, A third approach, or a third set of approaches that have been put forward, maybe is better, are contextual approaches that seek to embed individuals more into their social environment. One that I want to highlight is a role history approach that postulates that that post-event change and adjustment is kind of a function of pre-transition chronic stress. So basically how stressful the role was prior to the transition. So how stressful marriage was prior to divorce, for example. And this is interesting because it opens the window a bit to the pre-transition phase, right? So what happens before the event. And if we go back to this little simple picture, that means we can envision sort of here two different trajectories, right? The one trajectory being a relatively constant level of well-being and a deep decline when the event occurs, while the other has this sort of pre-transition decline. So when we look at this picture and we decide we want to, do some sort of study here to look at the association between a transition and some outcome over the course of this transition, then a few questions probably or hopefully should come to mind. So the first question is, well, what is exactly this before? I mean, it's kind of clear what comes afterwards, that this is sort of a post-transition change. But what this before is and kind of when that before starts isn't really super clear. When we look at the difference between these two lines, kind of what the difference, the area in between, exactly what is that's also not completely clear. And we also have to make a decision about, well, what is the comparison? So when we think about change in well-being over the process of an event. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through these questions really quickly and show you a little bit how they've been dealt with in current research for different transitions, kind of in a very broad sense. And then I'm going to go back to widowhood and tell you or try to convince you that that the way we're going to do it is a correct way, also eventually for other transitions. So when we think about this first question, what is this before? I would say the majority of studies that look at well-being in life course transitions, they simply look at a certain number of years before the event. So here you see for marriage and widowhood, and this is divorce with different outcomes, looking at about 5 years before the event. And I mean, this is generally or most likely kind of a practical approach based on data availability, for example. Another more nuanced answer to that question, what is this before, when does that before start, is when someone enters the risk group, right? So when they're at risk of experiencing an event. So this is maybe more of a demographic a way to approach the question. So here, as an example, Van Scheppingen and Leopold, they looked at the consequences of divorce, and they decided that the clock should start at marriage. So when people enter the risk set of divorce. So now we get to this red area. What is this? What is this red area? What does that mean? On the one hand, we can think that this red area, this difference between those who experience no change and those who experience a change in well-being prior to the transition, is some sort of effect of the transition itself, right? Is a lead or anticipation effect, as they've been termed. However, there are quite a few critical voices about that. So, for example, Ludwig and Brudele, they kind of argue that these lead and anticipation effects, they really shouldn't be over-interpreted or maybe interpreted at all because of omitted variable bias, so forming a union before marriage, a reverse causality, so becoming happier in a union and that leading to marriage, or selection on growth, right? So those who have the steepest growth and happiness being the most likely to marry. So these are all, oh, exactly. And then we get to our third question, right? So what is the comparison? Now, the most common approach to this comparison when thinking about processes, when thinking about events and outcomes, since the advent of longitudinal data, is to do a before and after comparison within individuals, right? So we would just look at average within change and well-being across that process, and would include some sort of dummy effect for before and after, maybe a set for time passed since the event. Another approach has been to extrapolate well-being based on pre-transition trajectories. So the idea here is for marriage leading up to divorce, for example, or widowhood, that there could be a decline in well-being, for example, here in life satisfaction, based on age or something else that's not being observed, and that we kind of want to get that out of the way when judging the assessing the impact of an event. And so here you see the ideas, I call this the after comparison, is to then look at the difference between these lines and say, okay, that's the effect of the event. Now, a different approach, again, going back to Van Schepping and Leopold, this paper, is to bring control groups back in as the main comparison group. And so what these two did with their study on divorce is they matched continuously married individuals with their divorced sample at the time of marriage, and then argue that by comparing these two lines across the time, that we're gauging the effect, if maybe the association, the effect of divorce prior to the transition, right? So these are kind of I would say the answers to those questions that would be found in the literature. Now we're going to provide some different answers with our study here, and hopefully convince you that this is a better way about thinking about these things. And of course, I'm going to apply them to widowhood. That's what we studied, but hopefully in the back of your mind, you'll also be able to start thinking, well, this can be used for quite a few different transitions. So with that first question, what is the before? When does it start? We're going to say, well, the before starts at the start of the process that leads to the event. Now, what is the process that leads to the event of widowhood? We're going to argue that this is terminal spousal health decline, right? So the declining health of the spouse. So what is that red area in the middle then? So we're going to argue that red in the middle, that's the change or the consequences of the process related to the transition. So we're using the idea of process to link those differences to the transition itself. And then what's the comparison? We're going to bring in this idea of contrasting our widowed groups to a control sample, but we're going to also say that we need to look at whether individuals experience this process or not. Okay, so like I said, we argued that the process leading to widowhood is the terminal health decline of the spouse. and that basically when we want to study the long-term consequences of widowhood, so going before the transition, that we need to start here before that process actually begins. Now, of course, it's completely possible that that the event widowhood occurs without the process, that it's in the case of unexpected widowhood, so unexpected or sudden death, for example, due to a car crash or whatnot. And in this case, you know, we would stick with kind of this idea of a two-period model where there's just a widowhood period and a post-widowhood period. And for mental health, we think, okay, there'll be a sharp decline in mental health in the widowhood period due to extreme disruptive and traumatic shock and intense grief. And during the post-widowhood period, we'd expect a partial recovery through automatic and active coping mechanisms. So this set point theory, for example. For economic well-being, during the widowhood period, we think about immediate income losses and costs related to funerals. But one thing, remember, there's no pre-widowhood period here, so no cumulative losses in income or no cumulative costs prior to that. But following in the following period, we might think then of a permanent loss of spousal income, annuities, pensions, and benefits, so that there's not really likely to be a complete recuperation here. But let's go back to the idea of bringing this process back in, that at least for widowhood and older age, that the majority of spousal losses will be preceded by a terminal health decline, and therefore will be expected to a certain degree. So here then we see that purple line coming back. And so for mental health, then during this pre-period, we'd expect a decline in mental health, for example, due to stress involved with caregiving, isolation and self-neglect of the caregiving spouse, and potentially anticipatory grief, so grieving before the transition actually occurs, before death. In terms of economic well-being, then on the one hand, we're going to look at the United States so that we can expect large medical and care expenses to come into play, but also income losses, not just of the dying spouse, but possibly the surviving spouse who needs to leave the labor market to take care of their spouse, for example. So in terms of economic well-being, but also mental well-being, we can think of there being sort of an accumulative cost that's starting much earlier during this process, right? Already in the pre-widowhood period. So now we come to questions revolving around assessing these pre-widowhood effects a little bit, and kind of more the appropriate comparisons more generally. And so what we are going to argue is that it's not enough to just match on experiencing the outcomes, experiencing the event of widowhood at the beginning, but we also need to match on experiencing this process or not, to kind of untangle this bit here in a better fashion. So what could that look like? Well, we can create a nice 2x2 table. As a sociologist, I find this always quite comforting. So we can think of 4 groups, right? Individuals who experience the event widowhood, yes, no, and individuals who experience the process leading up to widowhood. So this process of spousal health decline. So one relevant group for us would be Group D. So Group D, these are individuals who neither experience the event spousal loss, nor do they experience the process of spousal health decline. So that's why here I just put a constant line, because we wouldn't expect sort of any change related to the transition, right? They don't experience the transition or the process that leads to it. Now, our first group that we talked about earlier were the unexpected widows, right? So unexpected widowhood. These are then our group C, so individuals who experience the event, but don't experience the process. And if we match these individuals right at the beginning of the process to where they neither differ, then what we'd expect, of course, is to see no differences in well-being, mental health, or economic well-being prior to the event, and only for differences to emerge in the later, sort of during the event and in the post-event period. In contrast, for expected widowhood, here we get kind of that red to come in. Because so for our expected widows, then are here group A, individuals who both experience the event, widowhood, and who experience the process of terminal health decline of their spouses. So here we'd expect then, of course, a decline prior to the event, and then a post-transition recuperation. And so here, this contrast is what really allows us then to gauge what the consequences of the event are through this idea of linking it to a process. Okay, so now I'm going to get back to a little bit more of a standard research presentation instead of talking about using a lot of graphs and talking about life transitions. So just to remind you, what is this talk all about? What are the research aims? We're looking at what are the consequences of widowhood on mental and economic well-being across spousal loss. What we're going to do is we're going to use the US Health and Retirement Study and open our window of observation at 10 years before widowhood occurs, and look at the development of well-being until 6 years after spousal loss. And then we're going to see how those consequences differ to these two meaningful comparison groups that I talked about. So we're going to match individuals both on the event of widowhood, so having a treated and a control group, but also on the process of terminal spousal health decline to build these unexpected and expected widowhood comparisons that I just showed you. So we developed a four-step analytical approach to be able to do this, also with the idea that this should be easily applicable to other life transitions as well. So the first step is that we take the sample and we split it into those who we observed transition from married to widowed, and those who are only observed within marriage, right? So who don't transition. So the second step, so there we have our treated and control sample. Our second step is then to split the sample again into those who experience the process of spousal health decline and those who don't. So then we're creating individuals in this 2x2 table. Then we need to create the comparison groups, right? And so this is where we'll then create the unexpected and expected comparison groups by matching individuals on whether they experience the event 10 years before the event occurs, right? So before the process begins. And then we'll use pretty simple linear regressions to estimate cross-sectional differences between our treated and control groups, but also cumulative differences. And I think this idea of cumulative or total costs will become clear once we get there, and hopefully also intriguing. So that first step, splitting the sample, event or no event, we take all HRS respondents observed marriage at the first interview, our treated sample consists of persons who transition to widowhood with at least 5 waves prior to widowhood. So that means we have 10 or 9 years of data. And a control sample of continuously married respondents. And here we make sure that we have a minimum of 6 observations, so 12 or 11 years, so that we really have a long pre-transition time span for both groups. One thing that we also do is we restrict respondents to those with spouses who rate their health as excellent, very good, or good at first observation. This is to make sure that we don't sort of have anyone in our sample whose process already began, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to split the sample again, process or no process. And we're going to estimate random effects regressions where process time, so time, is the independent variable and spousal self-rated health is the dependent variable. And we're going to allow that coefficient to vary across individuals. This is just so we basically have a coefficient for everyone. We could have also just ran a regression for each individual, but that takes much longer. So those who have the lowest coefficient, so the lower third, we're going to say they experience a terminal health decline. They have experienced the largest decreases in spousal self-rated health. While those in the upper 50%, we're going to say correspond to no terminal health decline. Their health remains relatively constant. So to visualize that, here you can see the sample once we've split it into 4. So our main groups are going to be, of course, here group A, those who experience widowhood and terminal spousal health decline. So this is when basically the observation before widowhood occurs. And then our 2 groups up here, the one blue group, they experience the event of widowhood, but no spousal health decline. And our green group here, they experience neither health decline nor widowhood. So the next step, this third step, is now we need to make the comparison groups, the unexpected and the expected comparison group. And what we need to do is use propensity score matching to make sure that our treated sample, so that our main control group, our control group and our treated samples are similar before the process begins. So this will be 10 years before widowhood for the treated group or the first observation for our control group. And basically then we use a sample indicator in these propensity score matching models as a treatment indicator for the depression scale and for household income subtracted by out-of-pocket medical expenses. And we follow kind of others who have done something similar, and for every treated individual, for every to-be widow, we assign them 3 unique controls using the nearest neighbor method. So what this looks like basically is here you see the results of the match for unexpected widowhood. And what we want here, of course, is there to be no differences in our statistically significant differences in our sample. So for mental health, we see, small, virtually 0 differences, maybe less well done for spousal self-reported health. But important here on the process time coefficient, so whether there's that health decline or not, we have here near 0 and both equal. For our expected widowhood comparison, again, everything statistically not significant, but here then for the time for the process time coefficient, we want large differences here, right? So we see here that the treated group, the to-be widows, their spouses experience large declines in self-rated health prior to the event. So then, like I said, we're just going to use pretty simple linear regressions to look at these differences, estimate the cross-sectional differences, and then sum those up. So we've made it finally to the results. So what you can see here is process time, so 10 years prior to widowhood, up to 6 years following widowhood. On the left here, we're going to do mental health first. You see the reverse CSD score. And this is our unexpected widowhood comparison. So those who neither the widowed in black nor the continuously married in gray experienced a terminal health decline. And exactly what we expect is we see right up until the event, no differences in here our mental health score, but quite considerable then differences in the year or change in the year of widowhood, followed by recuperation with individuals returning to baseline levels or pre-widowhood levels, but also levels of the control group within 6 years. Now, in contrast, when we look at our expected widowhood comparison, we see again that the matching works quite well. So 10 years prior to the event, no differences here, but we see a pretty considerable decrease or decline in mental health in the years leading up to the event, right? With sort of statistically significant differences emerging around 5 years before the event. Again, we see a quite large decline in the year of the event, followed by a quicker, somewhat faster recuperation following widowhood. Although something interesting to look here, individuals do come back to baseline, so to their the year before widowhood levels, but they don't return to levels experienced by the control group, nor on their own, basically, if we compare to before the process began. So we can contrast now our unexpected widowhood and our expected widowhood comparison by summing up those differences across time, right? And so here we see that the costs in terms of mental health for the unexpected widowhood group are quite low, so around 0, but a bit less. But these confidence intervals are certainly too small. We're still kind of working on how to calculate those so that they're a bit more plausible. Followed by an increase then in the year of widowhood. But for the expected group, we see a quite considerable increase in across the process. So a very large difference in something like the cumulative mental health burden across the process of widowhood before the transition actually occurs, right? And so here, this is where we say, because of this idea of process and the methodological approach, we can really kind of argue that this is linked to the process leading up to the event. So now we can quickly look at the same figures, but now for household income minus out-of-pocket medical expenditures. So again, 10 years prior to widowhood, 6 years after. The matching here worked quite well. Again, for the unexpected widowhood comparison group, no differences really prior to spousal death. Then we see a relatively large drop in household income, followed by pretty constant differences. So like we thought, no real recovery in household income here, at least. Now, when we look at expected widowhood, we see again, well, what we expect is that there's a divergence much earlier, so about 5 years before the widowhood event, before spousal death occurs, a large drop, and then relatively constant differences post-spousal loss. And so when we put that into perspective, those two comparison groups, the unexpected and the expected groups, then again, we see that economic well-being decreases. So, right, the income difference, the income losses of the widowhood group increase quite quickly for the expected widowhood group, much less quickly for the unexpected widowhood group. After spousal loss, we see the difference between those two remain actually relatively similar, but the expected widowhood group has larger total losses because the process began earlier, right? So I'm just going to wrap up by kind of sharing what we think are some of our contributions. So we think on the one hand that that this project has a theoretical contribution and kind of more clearly theorizing and conceptualizing this pre-event period. So instead of thinking about role history simply in terms of something like chronic stress, by thinking about it in terms of the process that leads to the event. Methodologically, we also developed an approach that's that we hope is somewhat innovative and is easily applicable to other life transitions. So, for example, we've already applied this theoretical and methodological approach to divorce as an event and the process being marital breakdown using PARFAM data and looking again at income and well-being. And I was really surprised that quite quickly the expected results turned up very, very clearly. So that's very, very interesting. Now, more empirically, some contributions, especially to the widowhood literature, is that we don't find any pre-bereavement differences in mental health or economic well-being for those who didn't experience the process of terminal spousal health decline, but we find really large, or I would say considerable differences between those who lose their spouse and experience the process, and those who don't lose their spouse and don't experience the process, up to 5 years before spousal loss, for both mental health and economic well-being. So, and like I showed you, mental health may reach levels experienced 1 year prior to spousal loss for that expected widowhood group, but they don't really reach levels experienced by the control group or levels that they themselves experienced 10 years prior to spousal loss. So some of these statements on how resilient bereaved older adults may be could be overstated somewhat. And finally, the total costs of widowhood are really considerable for both the expected and unexpected widowhood groups in the United States. But some of those costs, the total costs, are really much greater for our expected widows and widowers because their process began much, much earlier. Okay, so thank you for joining and for listening. I hope it was interesting, and I really look forward to any questions and comments you might have. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.